Good morning. Like Taylor, I'm also going to talk about the Spanish epic, so I have 3 Alfonsos, and only one of which overlaps with Taylor's Alfonsos. But I'm going to discuss a different legend for which, unfortunately, we don't have any sort of poem as wonderful as the Poema de Mio Cid. We actually don't have any poem at all. And with that, one of the principal characteristics that distinguishes the medieval Castilian epic from that of other European traditions is the small number of extant epic poems. Only 3 poems have survived, and none in its entirety. Despite this lack of conserved poems, there is a significant preservation of epic tales in other literary forms, such as medieval chronicles and 15th and 16th century ballads, which suggests that other epic poems did exist at one point, though they have since been lost. The legend of Bernardo del Carpio is one of the numerous epic tales related in the Estoria de España, or the Primera Crónica General, a Castilian chronicle directed by Alfonso X during the final decades of the 13th century. Before its documentation in the Estoria de España, Bernardo's legend appeared in 2 Latin chronicles from the first half of the 13th century, Lucas de Thuis's Chronicon mundi and Rodrigo Jiménez de Rada's rebus Hispaniae. Additionally, the beginning of the Poema de Fernán González, a 13th century learned narrative poem, offers a brief account of the deeds of the hero. Of these 4 texts, the Estoria de España presents the most detailed version of the life and deeds of Bernardo del Carpio, elaborating episodes taken from the Latin sources and introducing others that are not related in the earlier texts. As Alfonso's chroniclers relate their version of the legend, they directly reference both Lucas de Thuis and Rodrigo Jiménez de Rada on numerous occasions. Additionally, on 4 occasions, all of which occur during episodes that are not presented in the Latin versions of the legend, the chroniclers reference cantares and fablas, or songs and tales about the hero, though no such compositions have been conserved in writing. In this presentation, I will analyze possible traces that the Cantares de Gesta, or epic poems, have left on the Alfonsine retelling of the legend of Bernardo del Carpio. While I will discuss in detail one particular episode in which a direct reference to the Cantares is made, I will give special consideration to 2 other episodes that do not reference the Cantares. In doing so, I will compare the narrative style and techniques of the chronistic version of the legend with those of extant Castilian epic poetry, and will discuss specific features of the plot in relation to other epic tales, considering the influence that epic poetry in general and Cantares specific to Bernardo del Carpio have had on the Alfonsine account of the legend. And before I talk about 3 specific episodes, I want to give you a brief summary of the legend as it's recounted in the Estoria de España, because it's not one of the more well-known Spanish legends. The legend of Bernardo del Carpio is set during the reigns of Alfonso II and Alfonso III, 2 non-successive Leonese kings, and there are 2 monarchs in between the 2. During the reign of Alfonso II, Bernardo was born of the secret marriage between Jimena, the sister of Alfonso, and San Diaz, the Count of Saldana. San Diaz is imprisoned, Jimena is sent to a convent, and Bernardo is raised in Alfonso's court. And at the end of this episode, the chroniclers directly reference a different account of the hero's origins, as it's told in Cantares and Fablas, or songs and tales, in which Bernardo is the son of Timbor, the sister of Charlemagne, and of San Diaz, the Count of Saldana. Later, Alfonso, having no heirs, promises his kingdom to Charlemagne. Alfonso's vassals protest, and Bernardo enlists the help of Marsilio, the Muslim king of Saragossa, in the battle against the French, and Charlemagne's troops are then defeated at Roncesvalles. After Roncesvalles, Bernardo is made aware of his lineage through a chess game, so at this point he had been unaware that his father was imprisoned in Luna and his mother was in a convent. And he then makes his first request for his father's freedom, which Alfonso refuses to grant. And this is the last episode pertaining to Bernardo del Carpio that's set in the reign of Alfonso II, and he's next mentioned in 3 sequential chapters in the reign of Alfonso III, all of which discuss his participation in battles fought between Alfonso and the Muslims. The chroniclers then recount a battle fought between Bernardo and a French nobleman, Bueso. After each battle, Bernardo asks for his father's freedom, which Alfonso denies. And after the battle against Bueso, Bernardo is fed up and he refuses to serve the king for 1 year. So the next year, Alfonso holds his court in Leon. The queen promises Bernardo that she will ask Alfonso for San Diaz's freedom if he will participate in the game of the tablado. He agrees, but the king refuses to grant the count's freedom and later exiles Bernardo. Bernardo then founds the castle El Carpio, which is how he gets his name, Bernardo del Carpio, and begins to ravage nearby areas. Alfonso surrounds El Carpio, and battles are waged until Alfonso's men advise him to release Bernardo's father. He assents and demands El Carpio in exchange for San Diaz's freedom, to which Bernardo agrees. However, they find that the count has already died. And so at this point, the chroniclers again reference songs about the hero in which Alfonso orders his men to bathe and dress the count, mount him on a horse, and take him to Bernardo. And so Bernardo meets his father's corpse, is very angry, lashes out against the king, and is again banished. So at this point, Bernardo travels to France, where he is received by Charles, his uncle, though he is rejected by Timbor, his half-brother, so the chroniclers return to his half-French origins. Dejected, he returns to Spain, where he populates the Canal de Jaca, marries, and spends the remainder of his life. And so as I've mentioned, within these episodes, there are only 4 instances in which the chroniclers directly reference the Cantares that would have pertained to Bernardo del Carpio. These refer to his half-French origin, both his birth and his eventual journey to the French court, to Bueso, the French nobleman whom the Cantares claimed to be Bernardo's cousin, and to the delivery of the body of Bernardo's father. Of these, the battle against Bueso and the delivery of Bernardo's father are the only 2 developed in detail, and the sole reference to the Cantares in the Bueso episode refers not to the combat itself, but rather to Bernardo's possible relationship with the Frenchmen. Despite this very brief reference, I believe other traces of the Cantares can be seen in the description of the battle against Bueso, and perhaps even a trace, beyond that of the reference to Bernardo and Bueso's relationship, of the specific cantar or cantares that Alfonso's chroniclers mention. In the Estoria de España, the battle against Bueso immediately follows 3 successive chapters that narrate various battles fought between Alfonso III and the Muslims. In those chapters, Bernardo was a mere participant in the battles. While the chroniclers always mention that he fought valiantly, the references to him tend to be brief without any specific description of the combat. Instead, they refer to his participation in general terms, stating that he fought and defeated the opposition, killing their leader and many others. The one exception within those 3 chapters is the description of a fierce Bernardo who, like a hungry lion, wreaked havoc on his adversaries. However, even that description does not relate an actual combat between Bernardo and a specific opponent, and the overall focus of these chapters is on Alfonso and his dealings with the invaders, and not actually on Bernardo. The battle against Bueso, on the other hand, is related in much different terms. In this episode, the chroniclers give a fairly detailed account of the one-on-one combat between Bernardo and Bueso, in which the 2 meet, strike each other hard enough that their lances break in half, so they grab their swords and continue to deliver blows until Bernardo eventually defeats Bueso. While it's not a long description by any means, it certainly provides more details than the preceding accounts of the battles with the Muslims. And more importantly, in this case, the focus of the episode is not Alfonso, as it was in the 3 preceding chapters, but Bernardo and his individual combat with Bueso, which reflects other epic battles in which a hero and his adversary fight one-on-one. Comparing, for example, the account of the battle against Bueso with the combat between Martín Antolines and Diego González in the Poema de Mi Cid, we note similar language used to describe the 2 encounters. In each case, the 2 opponents meet and strike each other with such fierce blows that both of their lances break. There's then a description of some or all of the battlers who metió or metieron mano a las espadas, metió in the case of the Poema de Mi Cid because it's only one person reaching for his sword, and metieron in the case of Bernardo del Carpio because it's both of them, but it's the same language used, seize their swords and continue to strike until the enemy has been defeated. The similarities between the language used in the Estoria de España and in the Poema de Mi Cid is not enough to suggest any direct influence of the Cantares de Gesta on this particular episode of the legend of Bernardo del Carpio. It could be that the chronicler had knowledge of the epic genre and incorporated formulaic language into his description of the battle. However, if we look more closely at the description of the one-on-one confrontation between Bernardo and Bueso, we can see the possible remnants of an ancient AO rhyme scheme. Describing the battle, the chronicle states, "Et fuéronse ferir un por otro tan regio, que ficieron trebar las lanzas por medio, mas al cabo venció Bernardo y mató a Bueso." These instances of medio, regio, and Bueso perhaps hint at Cantar, whose assonant rhyme scheme was AO. With this in mind, I believe that the influence of the Cantares on this episode goes beyond the detail of Bernardo and Bueso's relationship and includes the description of their one-on-one combat, either as a summary of details taken from a cantar or possibly as verses taken directly from that cantar. While these specific references to the Cantares are certainly noteworthy, I do not believe that these particular episodes are the only ones in which we can see possible traces of the Cantares de Gesta in the Alfonsine account of the legend of Bernardo del Carpio. And in the remainder of this presentation, I'm going to discuss 2 particular cases in which I believe influences of the Cantares can be seen. The first is the establishment of El Carpio and the subsequent battles with Alfonso III, and then the second is the episode of the Tablado and Bernardo's ensuing protest to the king. The description of the founding of El Carpio and the battle surrounding the fortress is presented in both the Chronicon mundi and De rebus Hispaniae, though the description in each Latin chronicle is extremely brief. Alfonso X's chroniclers, on the other hand, relate the establishment of El Carpio and the battles waged between Alfonso and Bernardo in far more detail. The Alfonsine descriptions are particularly noteworthy for their inclusion of direct speech and dialogue, which are two elements commonly found in epic poetry, found, for example, on multiple occasions in the poema de mi Cid. Within this episode in the Estoria de España, Bernardo addresses his men numerous times, describing in a speech that resembles a typical harangue, the battle strategies that they will employ, as well as the agreement that he will propose to the king. Similarly, there is a direct dialogue between Bernardo and Alfonso III after the battle, which culminates in the delivery of the corpse of Bernardo's father and the hero's exile, and those are two events that are not narrated in Latin chronicles. Although the chroniclers could have relied entirely upon the Latin sources for the general events surrounding the establishment of El Carpio, the lack of direct references to the chronicles, along with the marked presence of dialogue and direct speech, suggests the importance of other sources, especially considering that Alfonso's chroniclers do not use dialogue to amplify any of the other episodes that they take directly from the Latin sources. I believe this use of direct speech reflects traces that the Cantares de Gesta might have left on this episode, despite no direct reference to them. This hint of the Cantares could owe itself to a cantar specifically related to Bernardo del Carpio, or simply to the chroniclers' familiarity with the epic genre and their ability to incorporate that style into their work. Nevertheless, a very small detail in the episode suggests that it is more than just the chroniclers' familiarity with the epic genre that expanded the episode from its version in the Latin chroniclers to that in the Estoria de España. In the Estoria de España, immediately before Bernardo establishes El Carpio, the chronicler states that they say, or dicen, that he swore never to stop fighting until the king gave him his father. While Bernardo's anger towards Alfonso is documented in the Latin chronicles, there is not a point in which he swears never to stop fighting until the king frees his father. Therefore, the use of they say, dicen, cannot refer to Lucas-de or to Rodrigo Jiménez de Rada. It is then possible that the reference is either to Cantares circulating about Bernardo, or to stories that were circulating orally about him, which had been influenced by devices used in Cantares de Gesta. While the previous episode stands out for the narrative strategies employed in its retelling, the episode of the Tablado stands out primarily due to the events that are described, and to their similarities to incidents described in other Castilian epic tales. In this chapter, Bernardo refuses to participate in the Tablado until the queen promises him that she will ask for his father's freedom. He agrees, though her request is denied by Alfonso. As a response, Bernardo verbally lashes out at the king, which prompts Alfonso to banish him. The incorporation of the Tablado, so he has his lance and he's trying to hit a target, and if he's really macho, either the target breaks or his lance breaks. So this Tablado in the episode is reminiscent of the presence of the Tablado in the story of the Siete-Infantes de Lara, another Castilian epic tale for which many scholars agree there was a cantar that has since been lost. In the Siete-Infantes de Lara, one individual's success at the Tablado results in the provocation of another's anger, which leads to disastrous consequences. Similarly, a significant result of the Tablado episode in Bernardo's story is the fury of Alfonso III. As with the formulaic language employed in the battle against Bueso, the incorporation of the Tablado into the Alfonsine version of the legend of Bernardo del Carpio could simply reflect the chronicler's familiarity with other epic tales and their subsequent incorporation of those themes into their version of a pre-existing legend. However, Bernardo's subsequent diatribe against Alfonso III raises questions as to the source or sources of this particular episode. After Alfonso once again refuses to free Bernardo's father, Bernardo launches into a heated recitation of all of the services that he's done as Alfonso's vassal. During his rant, he reminds Alfonso of the battle at Benavente, in which he gave Alfonso his horse after the king's was killed, details that are reminiscent of an episode in the poema de mi Cid in which the Cid wins a horse from Minaya, his right-hand man, after the latter's was killed. While the battle against Ores at Benavente is related in the Estoria de España as one of the numerous battles between Alfonso III and the Muslims, it's part of that sequence of 3 chapters in which Bernardo is just mentioned. There's no mention of Bernardo giving Alfonso his horse after the king's was killed. In fact, the only mention of Bernardo is a brief side note which mentions that he fought well in the battle. Therefore, we must ask where the additional details of the battle at Benavente came from. In the Estoria de España, The side note that mentions that Bernardo fought well at Benavente begins with the phrase, "E cuenta aquí la historia," or the story or history tells that. At times within the Alfonsine version of the legend, the chroniclers use historia to refer to what is said about Bernardo in the Latin texts. However, the battle at Benavente is not narrated in either the Chronica Mundi or the Rebus Hispaniae. In this case, it is possible that historia refers to the stories that were circulating orally about Bernardo, as no such written history survives, and that such stories were profoundly influenced by other epic songs and tales of the time, such as the stories of the Cid and the Siete Infantes de Lara. And it could then be that it is those stories that left their mark on the episode at Benavente. The historiography completed by the compilers of the Estoria de España is striking, given their efforts to collect, analyze, and combine various sources to present the legend of Bernardo del Carpio. Given the numerous episodes that appear in the Alfonsine version of the legend, but do not appear in the two Latin chronicles, the Chronica Mundi and the Rebus Hispaniae, we must consider what other sources Alfonso's chroniclers were manipulating as they compiled their version of the legend. On 4 distinct occasions, as I mentioned, the chroniclers reference Cantares about the hero, giving us a glimpse of what some of those other sources would have been. Despite these few and brief references, further consideration of episodes such as the confrontation with Bueso, which does mention the Cantares, as well as episodes that do not, such as the Tablado and the establishment and defense of El Carpio, suggests not only a general influence of the epic genre on the legend, but also that the chroniclers incorporated details from now lost Cantares into their retelling, leaving a profound trace of the Cantares de Gesta on the Alfonsine version of the legend of Bernardo del Carpio. Thank you.